My daughter-in-law tried to take custody of my own daughter. When I entered the courtroom, she rolled her eyes. But the judge froze and whispered, "Is it really her?" Silence fell over the room. None of them knew who I truly was.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Until that moment when everything I had built over 35 years in the judiciary came flooding back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it all began, 3 months earlier, on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. I never thought the day would come when I'd be treated like an incompetent child in my own home. At 68, after a career spanning 35 years in the judiciary, I had chosen a simple, quiet life alongside Emma, my 16-year-old adopted daughter. But Victoria, my daughter-in-law, had other plans for me. The morning started normally. I was preparing breakfast for Emma when I heard the sound of cars in the driveway. Through the window, I saw Victoria stepping out of her silver BMW, followed by a woman in a white uniform I didn't recognize. My stomach clenched. Victoria never came without warning, and certainly not bringing strangers. "Barbara, we're here!" Victoria's voice echoed through the house before they even knocked. She always spoke as if she owned the place, but today there was something different in her tone, an authority that made me freeze. I opened the door, and Victoria entered without being invited, followed by the woman in white. "Barbara, this is Sheila, a private nurse I hired for you. I thought it was time to have someone professional taking care of your basic needs." I stood there trying to process what was happening. "Victoria, I don't need a nurse. I'm perfectly fine." "Of course you need one, dear." The word dear came out of her mouth like poison disguised as honey. "A woman your age, caring for a teenager alone. It's too much responsibility. Sheila will help with your medications, your routine, those things we sometimes forget." Emma came down the stairs at that moment, stopping abruptly when she saw the scene. Her eyes went from me to Victoria, then to the nurse, with a confused expression. "What's happening?" Emma asked, her voice loaded with concern. "Nothing major, sweet Emma," Victoria said, approaching my daughter with that fake smile I knew well. "I'm just taking care of Grandma Barbara. Sometimes older people need extra help." Grandma Barbara. She had never called me that before. It was always mother-in-law, or simply Barbara. The use of this childish term in front of Emma was calculated, I knew. Sheila, the nurse, began circling my kitchen as if conducting an inspection. She opened some cabinets, looked at the refrigerator, made notes on a clipboard. "Where do you keep your medications, ma'am?" she asked, as if I were a patient. "I don't take medications," I replied, feeling irritation growing. "Just vitamins, which are in the kitchen cabinet." "Oh, that's good," Sheila said, taking my multivitamin bottle. "I'll organize everything properly so you don't forget to take them." I watched, incredulous, as she stuck a label on the bottle. "For the old lady, take one in the morning." The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. 40 years defending human dignity in courtrooms, and now I was being treated like a child who couldn't read. "Victoria, this is unnecessary and offensive," I said, trying to keep my voice calm in front of Emma. "Offensive?" Victoria laughed, that metallic laugh that always irritated me. "Barbara, you're being dramatic. It's just organization. Emma needs to see that you're being well cared for." Emma looked at me with that expression I feared seeing, pity mixed with uncertainty. Victoria was planting seeds of doubt in my daughter's head, and I could see it working. "You know," Victoria continued, walking around the room like an inspector, "Emma mentioned that sometimes you forget to pick her up from school at the right time." "That happened once," I protested. "I was at the dentist and the appointment ran 15 minutes late." "And when you forgot to buy the ingredients for her science project?" "I didn't forget. We changed the project because—" "See, Emma?" Victoria interrupted, addressing my daughter directly. "Sometimes older adults have difficulty admitting when they need help. It's normal in aging." The word aging echoed through the room like a verdict. Emma lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable, but I could see that Victoria's words were taking effect. "Emma needs a more structured environment," Victoria continued, "a consistent routine, regular medical care, proper supervision for a teenager." It was then that she approached my shelf of legal books where my most valued prize sat. a heavy bronze plaque with the inscription, Magistrate of the Year, Barbara Harrison, in recognition of 35 years of exceptional service to justice. It was my most cherished trophy, not for the recognition, but for what it represented, decades dedicated to protecting the vulnerable and ensuring justice. Victoria picked up the plaque, pretending to admire it. "My, how heavy," she commented, running her fingers over the inscription. "You must be very proud of this." "I am," I replied, watching her every movement with growing apprehension. "It's a shame how these old things get dusty," she said, handling the plaque carelessly. "Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past, don't you think?" And then it happened. The plaque slipped from her hands, or at least that's what it looked like, and fell to the marble floor with a deafening crash. The bronze cracked right down the middle, splitting my name in half. Barbara Har, Ryson. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat. Emma let out a small scream of shock. Sheila stopped her note-taking. And Victoria? Victoria covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with false surprise. "Oh my God, Barbara! What a disaster! I'm so sorry!" Her voice was loaded with theatrical concern that wouldn't fool anyone with half a brain. "My hands are so shaky today. Must be the stress of worrying about you." I knelt on the floor, picking up the pieces of my award. 35 years of career broken on my own living room floor. Tears burned my eyes, but I wasn't going to give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing me cry. "It wasn't an accident," I murmured, more to myself than to anyone else. "What?" Victoria crouched down beside me, pretending to try to help. "Barbara, of course it was an accident. Why would I do something like that on purpose?" Emma stood in the middle of the room, clearly traumatized by the scene. It was exactly what Victoria wanted, for my daughter to see me as a fragile old woman having paranoid episodes. "Emma, dear," Victoria said, standing up and placing a protective arm around the teenager's shoulders. "Why don't you go to your room while Grandma Barbara and I talk about making things safer here at home?" As Emma went upstairs, clearly disturbed, Victoria turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Barbara," she said, her voice low and controlled, "I think it's high time we had a serious conversation about what's best for Emma. A girl her age needs stability, structure, a home where she doesn't have to worry about accidents." I was still holding the pieces of my award, feeling the cold weight of bronze in my hands. 35 years protecting families, defending children, ensuring justice was done. And now I was being treated like a senile old woman in my own home. "Emma stays with me," I said, my voice firmer than I felt inside. "She's my daughter." "For now," Victoria replied. And there was something in the way she said it that made me understand. This wasn't just the beginning of a humiliation campaign. It was the first move in a war she was already winning. After they left, I sat in my favorite armchair, still holding the pieces of the award. The house was too quiet, and I could hear Emma crying softly in her room. Victoria had achieved exactly what she wanted in a single morning, made me appear fragile, paranoid, and incapable in front of my own daughter. But as I looked at my intact legal library, at the volumes of jurisprudence I had studied for decades, I felt something beyond pain and humiliation. I felt the awakening of a determination I hadn't felt in years. Victoria had chosen the wrong person to try to destroy. She had no idea who I really was. 2 weeks after the accident with my award, I began noticing things. Small things at first. Objects moved slightly from where I'd left them, my reading glasses appearing in rooms I hadn't visited, the television volume mysteriously changing overnight. I attributed it to stress, to the emotional toll of Victoria's increasing interference in my life with Emma. I was wrong. Victoria wasn't just playing psychological games. She was building a case. The first real sign came on a Thursday morning when I was making Emma's lunch. I reached for my favorite tea blend, a chamomile mix that helped me sleep, and noticed the box felt different, lighter. When I opened it, half the tea bags were missing, and the remaining ones looked slightly different. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make me question myself. "Emma," I called upstairs, "did you use my chamomile tea?" "No, Mom," she replied, using the name that always warmed my heart. "You know I don't like tea." I stood there, staring at the box, wondering if I was losing my mind. Maybe Victoria was right. Maybe I was starting to forget things, misplace items, lose track of details. The doubt crept in like poison, exactly as she intended. That afternoon, while Emma was at school, I decided to rest in my study. I'd been feeling unusually drowsy lately, especially after my morning tea. As I settled into my leather reading chair, I noticed something that made my blood freeze, a tiny red light blinking from behind my law books. I approached slowly, my hands trembling as I moved aside volumes of constitutional law. There, no bigger than a button, was a small camera lens with a blinking recording light. My entire body went cold. I checked behind other furniture, in corners, near the kitchen where I prepared meals. 6 cameras. 6 hidden recording devices planted throughout my home, capturing every moment of my daily life. But that wasn't the worst part. When I found the 7th camera, this one positioned to record my bedroom, I discovered something that made me nauseous. The device was warm to the touch and showed signs of recent tampering. Someone had been in my house, in my private spaces, while I slept. I didn't call the police. I should have, but 40 years of legal experience taught me something crucial. Never reveal your hand until you understand the full scope of your opponent's strategy. Instead, I did something Victoria never expected from a confused old woman. I started documenting everything. Over the next week, I kept detailed notes of every incident: the missing tea bags, the moved objects, the increasing drowsiness after my morning routine. I also noticed something else. The drowsiness only occurred on days when Victoria had visited recently, days when she'd insisted on making me tea, claiming she wanted to help with the household tasks. The pattern was becoming clear, but I needed proof. I waited until Emma was at a sleepover with friends, then carefully prepared my own cup of chamomile tea using the bags from my potentially tampered box. Instead of drinking it, I poured it into a glass jar and sealed it tightly. If Victoria was drugging me, I would have evidence. The next morning, I pretended to be groggier than usual when she arrived with Sheila for one of their wellness checks. I let Victoria guide me to my chair, allowed her to fuss over my confusion, and watched as she exchanged meaningful glances with the nurse. "She's been having more episodes," Victoria told Sheila in a voice loud enough for me to hear, as if I were deaf as well as senile. Yesterday, she accused someone of breaking into the house and moving her things around. Paranoid delusions are common in early dementia. Sheila made notes on her clipboard while I pretended to doze in my chair, but I was listening to every word, watching every gesture, memorizing every detail of their performance. "The social worker will want to see evidence of the living situation deteriorating," Sheila said quietly. "Maybe we should schedule the next visit for tomorrow afternoon? I could make sure she seems more disoriented than usual." "Perfect," Victoria replied. "I'll make sure to prepare her special tea before they arrive." They thought I was asleep, but I heard every word of their conspiracy. Victoria wasn't just trying to prove I was incompetent. She was actively making me incompetent through drugs, then documenting my deteriorated state for legal proceedings. After they left, I forced myself to vomit up what little of the drugged tea I'd consumed, then called a private laboratory I'd used during complex court cases years ago. The analysis would take 48 hours, but I suspected I already knew what they'd find. That evening, Emma came home from her sleepover more subdued than usual. She sat at our kitchen table, pushing food around her plate instead of eating. "Mom," she said finally, "some of the other girls were asking questions about you. About whether you're getting sick or something." My heart sank. "What kind of questions?" "They said their parents heard that Victoria hired a nurse for you, and that maybe you can't take care of me anymore." Emma's voice was small, fragile. "Is that true? Are you sick?" I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "Emma, look at me. I am not sick. I am not confused. And I am absolutely capable of taking care of you. Then why is Victoria saying those things? Why does she keep bringing that nurse woman here?" It was the question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to a 16-year-old that her stepmother-in-law is systematically destroying your life? How do you reveal that level of human cruelty without destroying her faith in people? "Sometimes, sweetheart, Adults make decisions based on fear rather than facts. Victoria is afraid that something might happen to you in my care, so she's being overly cautious. It was a lie, but it was a lie that protected Emma's innocence while buying me time to gather evidence. "But I don't want to leave you," Emma whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "You're my real mom. You chose me when nobody else wanted me." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Emma had come to me through the foster system at age 12, after bouncing between homes for years. She'd been sullen, angry, convinced that no one would ever want her permanently. It took 2 years of patience, consistency, and unconditional love before she started calling me Mom. "And I will never stop choosing you," I promised, squeezing her hands, "no matter what anyone says or does." But even as I made that promise, I could see the doubt Victoria had planted growing in Emma's eyes. The teenager was torn between loyalty to me and the growing evidence that maybe, just maybe, the adults around her were right to be concerned. The laboratory results arrived Friday morning via secure email. The tea contained traces of a mild sedative, enough to cause drowsiness and confusion, but not enough to be immediately dangerous. It was the perfect crime, making me appear naturally declining while leaving no obvious evidence of foul play. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated her opponent. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I called Robert, my son, Victoria's husband, and asked him to come over alone. He arrived looking uncomfortable, clearly coached by his wife about my deteriorating condition. Robert sat stiffly on my couch, avoiding direct eye contact, treating me like a fragile mental patient who might become agitated at any moment. "Mom," he said carefully, "Victoria told me you've been having some difficulties lately. Confusion, memory problems, paranoid thoughts about people breaking into the house. Did she also tell you she's been drugging my tea and installing hidden cameras throughout my home?" The words hung in the air like an accusation in a courtroom. Robert's expression shifted from careful concern to shocked disbelief. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that has us worried. Victoria is trying to help you, and you're interpreting her kindness as some kind of conspiracy." I walked to my desk and pulled out the laboratory report, the photographs I'd taken of the hidden cameras, and my detailed log of incidents over the past month. I laid them out in front of my son like evidence in a trial. "This is not paranoia, Robert. This is documentation." He looked at the papers, his face pale as he absorbed the implications. "This can't be right. Victoria wouldn't. She's not capable of. Your wife has been systematically drugging me to create evidence of mental incompetence. She's recorded me in my most private moments to build a case for taking custody of Emma, and she's convinced you that I'm the one who's lost touch with reality." Robert stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Even if this is true, and I'm not saying it is, why would Victoria do such a thing? What would she gain from taking Emma away from you?" That was the question I'd been investigating, and the answer was more disturbing than I'd imagined. But before I could respond, we heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Victoria was back, 3 hours early from her supposed shopping trip. Through the window, I saw her talking rapidly on her phone, gesturing angrily. When she noticed Robert's car in my driveway, her expression changed to something cold and calculating. "She knows," I said quietly. "Somehow, she knows we're talking." Robert looked confused, but I understood. Victoria had been monitoring more than just my daily activities. The cameras weren't just recording, they were transmitting. She'd been watching us in real time, and now she was about to escalate her campaign to a level I hadn't anticipated. As Victoria's car door slammed shut, I realized that everything that had happened so far was just preparation. The real battle was about to begin, and my son, manipulated and confused, was about to be forced to choose between his wife and his mother. The front door opened without a knock, and Victoria's voice filled the house with false sweetness. "Robert? Barbara? What a lovely surprise to find you both here together." But her eyes told a different story entirely. Victoria entered my living room like a predator who'd caught her prey in a trap. Her eyes swept over the evidence I'd spread out for Robert, the lab reports, the photographs of hidden cameras, my detailed documentation of her systematic campaign against me. For just a moment, her mask of concern slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice maintaining that sickly sweet tone while her eyes blazed with fury. Robert looked between his wife and the damning evidence on my coffee table. "Victoria, Mom has some serious accusations. She says you've been drugging her tea and recording her without consent." I watched Victoria's face carefully, noting the micro-expressions that 40 years of reading defendants had taught me to recognize. The slight tightening around her eyes, the barely perceptible pause before she responded. The way her left hand unconsciously touched her throat, a classic tell of deception. "Oh, Robert," she sighed, settling into the chair across from us with theatrical exhaustion. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. Barbara's paranoid delusions are getting worse. She's imagining elaborate conspiracies where none exist." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table toward my son. "I've already consulted with a lawyer, darling. Someone who specializes in these difficult family situations." My blood went cold as I read the name on the card, Marcus Wellington, Esquire. I knew that name. 23 years ago, I'd presided over a case where Wellington had attempted to manipulate evidence and intimidate witnesses. I'd held him in contempt of court and recommended his disciplinary review to the state bar. He'd never forgiven the humiliation, and he'd certainly never forgotten the judge who damaged his reputation. "You hired Marcus Wellington," I said, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. "You know him?" Victoria's eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. "What a wonderful coincidence. He mentioned he'd had dealings with judges from your era. Said he had particular insight into how the legal system treats aging judicial officers who've lost their edge." The threat was unmistakable. Wellington wasn't just any lawyer. He was a man with a personal vendetta against me, and Victoria had found him deliberately. "Barbara," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "Mr. Wellington explained that former judges often have the hardest time accepting help because they're used to being in control. He called it judicial dementia, the inability to recognize when one's mental faculties are declining." Robert was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "Victoria, those aren't real medical terms, and Mom's evidence here." "Can be easily explained," she interrupted smoothly. "The laboratory report? Barbara could have tampered with the tea herself and then tested it to support her delusions. The cameras? She probably placed them herself during one of her confused episodes and then forgot about it. It's actually more common than you'd think in cases of early-onset dementia." I had to admire her strategy, even as it terrified me. Victoria had an answer for everything, and she was presenting them with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed these responses extensively. "The point is," Victoria stood up, straightening her designer jacket, "we can't wait any longer. Emma's safety is at stake. I've scheduled an emergency custody hearing for tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow?" Robert looked shocked. "That's incredibly fast for a custody case." "Mr. Wellington has connections in the family court system. When there's evidence of immediate danger to a minor, judges can expedite proceedings." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Especially when the guardian is a former colleague who's clearly in cognitive decline." The room spun around me. In less than 24 hours, I would be standing in a courtroom, not as the respected Judge Harrison who'd spent decades protecting families, but as Barbara Harrison, the allegedly incompetent elderly woman trying to maintain custody of a teenager. "I'll need character witnesses," I said, my legal training kicking in despite my emotional turmoil. "About that," Victoria said, pulling out her phone, "I've been in touch with several people from your past, colleagues, neighbors, people who've observed your recent behavior." She showed me a text conversation thread that made my heart sink. Names I recognized: former court staff, retired attorneys, neighbors from my old courthouse days, all expressing concern about my mental state, all agreeing that poor Barbara seemed to be struggling with the transition to retirement. "How did you—" I began, then stopped. "Of course," Victoria had spent months building this case, reaching out to people who knew me professionally, planting seeds of doubt about my competency. It wasn't difficult, she said, scrolling through more messages. People are naturally concerned when they hear that a respected judge is having difficulties adjusting to civilian life, especially when there's a vulnerable teenager involved. Robert was reading over her shoulder, his expression growing more troubled with each message. Mom, Judge Peterson says he's noticed you seeming disoriented at the grocery store last month, and Mrs. Chen from the courthouse gift shop mentioned you seemed confused about what day it was. I closed my eyes, remembering those incidents differently. Judge Peterson had approached me while I was comparing prices on Emma's favorite cereal. I'd been distracted, not disoriented. Mrs. Chen had mentioned it being Monday when it was actually Tuesday, and I'd politely corrected her, not the other way around. But Victoria had reframed every interaction, every moment of normal human distraction, into evidence of cognitive decline. And she'd done it so systematically that even people who'd known me for decades were questioning my mental state. There's more, Victoria continued, her voice gaining confidence as she sensed victory. Emma herself has expressed concerns. That's not true, I said immediately. Isn't it? Victoria pulled up a recording on her phone. Emma, honey, can you tell us about living with Grandma Barbara? Has she been acting differently lately? Emma's voice, small and uncertain, filled my living room. She's been forgetting things more often, and sometimes she seems scared of nothing. Yesterday, she thought someone had been in the house moving her stuff around. She gets really upset when I ask about it. The recording stopped, leaving silence that felt like a verdict. My own daughter, speaking words that sounded damning without context, without understanding the manipulation that had preceded them. When did you record that? I demanded. Last week, during one of our family conversations. Emma trusts me, Barbara. She tells me things she's afraid to tell you because she doesn't want to hurt your feelings. Robert was looking at me with something I'd never seen before, pity mixed with fear. His mother, the woman who'd raised him alone after his father left, who'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college, who'd taught him right from wrong, was being systematically destroyed in front of his eyes. The hearing is at 2 p.m. tomorrow, Victoria announced, gathering her purse and phone. Family Court, Judge Morrison presiding. Robert, I think it would be best if you came with me. We'll need to present a united front for Emma's sake. As she moved toward the door, she turned back one final time. Oh, and Barbara? You might want to consider not representing yourself. Mr. Wellington suggested that attempting to act as your own counsel would only demonstrate further evidence of poor judgment and detachment from reality. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a gavel falling. I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by evidence that proved Victoria's guilt, but would likely be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a declining mind. In 18 hours, I would walk into a courtroom where I'd once commanded absolute respect and authority, and I would be treated as a potentially dangerous elderly woman who couldn't be trusted with her own daughter. But Victoria had made one crucial error in her strategy. In her arrogance, in her certainty that she'd destroyed my credibility completely, she'd overlooked something fundamental about the justice system I'd served for 35 years. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. Harold? It's Barbara Harrison. I need a favor, and I need it tonight. Harold Martinez had been my court clerk for 15 years before becoming a private investigator, specializing in family court cases. If anyone could help me gather evidence in the next 18 hours, it would be him. Judge Harrison? His voice was warm with surprise and concern. I heard some troubling rumors. What's going on? I spent the next hour explaining everything. Victoria's systematic campaign, the drugged tea, the hidden cameras, the manipulated evidence. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions with the precision that had made him invaluable in my courtroom. Judge, this is sophisticated psychological manipulation combined with legal intimidation. She's not just trying to take custody. She's trying to destroy your reputation permanently. But why? What does she gain from this? It was the question that had been haunting me. I think it's about Emma's trust fund. She comes into a substantial inheritance when she turns 18, money from her biological parents' estate. If Victoria gains custody now, She'll have legal authority over those funds. How substantial? Harold asked. $2.7 million. The silence on the other end told me Harold understood the stakes. This wasn't just about family dynamics or personal vendettas. This was about money, and people had committed far worse crimes for far less. Judge, I need you to understand something. Tomorrow's hearing isn't just about custody. If Wellington succeeds in having you declared mentally incompetent, you'll lose more than Emma. You'll lose your legal rights, your financial independence, potentially even your freedom if they pursue guardianship proceedings. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Victoria's plan was far more comprehensive than I'd imagined. She wasn't just taking Emma away from me. She was taking everything. My daughter, my dignity, my autonomy, and ultimately, my identity. But she'd forgotten one crucial fact about judges, even retired ones. We don't just know the law. We know how to fight for justice, even when the system seems stacked against us, especially then. The battle for Emma was about to become a war for my very existence, and I refused to go down without reminding everyone in that courtroom exactly who Barbara Harrison really was. Harold arrived at my house at 11 p.m., carrying a briefcase and wearing the same focused expression I remembered from our most challenging cases. Behind him was a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, carrying professional recording equipment. Judge Harrison, this is Detective Sarah Kim, retired from the Financial Crimes Unit. She now specializes in investigating fraud cases involving elderly victims. Harold set his briefcase on my kitchen table with the same careful precision he'd used when organizing court documents decades ago. Mrs. Harrison, Detective Kim said, settling into a chair across from me. Harold filled me in on the basics, but I need to understand the timeline more clearly. When did you first adopt Emma? And what were the circumstances of her trust fund? I poured coffee and settled into what felt like a familiar rhythm, the methodical building of a case. Emma came to me through the foster system 4 years ago, when she was 12. Her biological parents died in a car accident, leaving her their entire estate. The money was placed in trust until her 18th birthday, with the adoptive parent, me, serving as trustee. Who else knows about the trust fund? Detective Kim asked, making notes. Victoria, certainly. Robert knows there's an inheritance, but I don't think he knows the full amount. Emma knows she'll have money for college, but not the specifics. I paused, remembering something. But Victoria would have access to those details through Robert's financial disclosures when they applied for their mortgage last year? Harold looked up from his laptop. Judge, I've been doing preliminary research on Victoria Morrison. Her maiden name was Victoria Chen, and there are some interesting patterns in her history. He turned his screen toward me, showing a series of legal documents. 3 years ago, she was involved in a dispute over her grandmother's estate. The case was settled out of court, but the allegations were familiar. Detective Kim leaned over to read the documents. Claims that Victoria manipulated an elderly relative's medical care to gain power of attorney. The grandmother later recanted her accusations, but only after Victoria had already transferred significant assets. My coffee went cold as I absorbed the implications. She's done this before. More than that, Harold continued, pulling up another file. I cross-referenced her employment history. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative for 2 years before marrying your son. She'd have detailed knowledge of medications and their effects. The sedatives in my tea, I whispered. Exactly. And Judge, there's something else. I pulled the surveillance footage from the security system at your bank. Victoria has been making regular visits to speak with investment advisors about preparing for her stepdaughter's future financial needs. Detective Kim pulled out her tablet, showing me bank records. These are legal to access because the trust fund requires quarterly reporting to the court. Victoria has been asking detailed questions about transferring custodial responsibilities and accessing funds for emergency medical care for the child's guardian. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Victoria hadn't just stumbled into this opportunity. She'd married into it, planned for it, and was now executing a strategy she'd likely used before. We need more than patterns and suspicious behavior, I said, falling back on decades of legal training. We need concrete evidence that will hold up in court tomorrow. Harold smiled, the same expression he'd worn when delivering crucial evidence that turned a case around. That's where it gets interesting. Judge, do you remember your old bailiff, Miguel Santos? Of course. He worked courtroom security for 20 years. He now runs a private security company. Very discreet, very thorough. When I told him what was happening to you, he volunteered to help. Harold paused. Miguel has been conducting surveillance on Victoria for the past 6 hours. Detective Kim pulled out her phone. Miguel, are you there? We're ready for the report. Miguel's voice came through clearly on speakerphone. Judge Harrison, it's an honor to help you. I've been following Mrs. Morrison since she left your house this afternoon, and what I found is going to change everything. Tell us, I said, my heart pounding. First, she didn't go home. She drove directly to Marcus Wellington's office and spent 3 hours in a meeting. I couldn't record what was said, but I photographed everyone who entered and left the building. Harold was typing rapidly on his laptop. Who else was there? That's the interesting part. Dr. Elizabeth Foster came at 4 p.m. and stayed for 2 hours. She's a psychiatrist who specializes in competency evaluations. My stomach dropped. They're bringing in an expert witness. More than that, Miguel continued. After Dr. Foster left, another woman arrived. Someone I recognized from my courthouse days. Brenda Walsh, the social worker who specializes in emergency custody removals. Detective Kim looked grim. They're not just planning to question your competency tomorrow. They're planning to have you removed from your home immediately after the hearing. There's more, Miguel said. After the meeting, Victoria drove to a storage facility across town. She spent 40 minutes there, loading boxes into her car. When she left, I followed her to a house I didn't recognize. Expensive neighborhood, probably worth $2 million. Whose house? Harold asked. According to property records, it belongs to Victoria's sister, Lisa Chen Morrison. But here's what's interesting. The house has been empty for months. It's been prepared recently with furniture, children's bedroom accessories, everything needed for a teenager to move in immediately. The room fell silent as we absorbed the implications. Victoria hadn't just been building a legal case. She'd been preparing Emma's new living situation, confident that she would win custody. Judge, Detective Kim said carefully, there's something else Miguel discovered that you need to hear. What is it? Miguel's voice became more serious. While Victoria was at the storage facility, she made several phone calls. I was close enough to hear fragments of conversations. She was talking to someone about eliminating the remaining obstacle, and mentioned something about the old woman won't be a problem much longer. Harold and Detective Kim exchanged glances that made my blood run cold. What aren't you telling me? I demanded. Detective Kim pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. Barbara, we've been investigating Victoria's previous cases more thoroughly. Her grandmother, the one from the estate dispute 3 years ago, died 6 months after the case was settled. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. But, I prompted, but the attending physician noted unusual circumstances. The grandmother had been in good health, taking only vitamins and blood pressure medication. She died suddenly of what appeared to be a heart attack, but there were traces of compounds in her system that were inconsistent with her prescribed medications. Harold's voice was gentle but firm. Judge, we think Victoria's plan goes beyond just taking Emma away from you. We think she's planning to ensure you never challenge her custody or control of the trust fund. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of my wall clock, the same clock that had marked time through 40 years of my life in this house, through Emma's childhood, through all the normal moments that Victoria was systematically destroying. What do we do? I asked, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Detective Kim leaned forward. We have 18 hours to gather evidence that will not only protect Emma, but potentially save your life. Miguel is continuing surveillance through the night. Harold and I are going to help you prepare a counterattack that Victoria never saw coming. What kind of counterattack? Harold smiled, and for a moment, I saw the young clerk who'd helped me navigate my first complex case 30 years ago. Judge, you taught me something a long time ago. You said the best defense is often hiding your strength until the moment you strike. Victoria thinks she's destroyed your credibility completely. She has, hasn't she? Not even close. Harold pulled out his phone and showed me a text thread. I've been in contact with retired Judge Patricia Williams, Judge David Chen, and Judge Robert Martinez. 3 of your former colleagues who are very much alive, very much respected, and very angry about what's being done to you. Detective Kim opened her laptop. We've also contacted the State Bar Association. Marcus Wellington's disciplinary record shows a pattern of ethical violations, including the case you presided over 23 years ago. His license has been under review twice in the past 5 years. But most importantly, Harold continued, we found something Victoria doesn't know we found. He pulled out a small digital recorder. Miguel placed this in Wellington's office during a security check this afternoon. It's been recording for 6 hours. My hands trembled as I took the device. What did you hear? Victoria and Wellington planning not just your legal destruction, but discussing how to access Emma's trust fund immediately after gaining custody. They've already prepared documents to claim you're a flight risk who might try to take Emma and disappear with the money. Detective Kim added quietly. They also discussed contingency plans if you proved more difficult to handle than expected. Plans involving your accidental medication overdose or a convenient fall down your stairs. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence that followed. Tomorrow, I said finally. When I walk into that courtroom, Victoria expects to see a broken, confused old woman who can barely defend herself. That's right, Harold confirmed. And instead, Harold's smile widened. Instead, she's going to discover that Judge Barbara Harrison has spent the night building the strongest case of her career. And this time, it's not just about justice, it's about survival. Outside, a car drove slowly past my house. Detective Kim glanced at the window and nodded to Miguel's voice on the phone. Victoria's back. She's watching the house from across the street. Let her watch, I said, standing up and moving to my law library. She's about to learn what happens when you underestimate a judge who has nothing left to lose. I pulled down my copy of Family Law Procedures, the same book I'd consulted thousands of times during my career. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom not as a victim, but as an advocate for my daughter and myself. And Victoria Morrison was about to discover that some opponents are far more dangerous when they appear defeated. I arrived at the courthouse at 1:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the hearing. I wore the same simple navy suit I'd chosen deliberately, the one I'd worn on my very first day as a judge 40 years ago. It was understated, professional, and sent a message that only I understood. I was returning to my domain. The media circus outside shocked me. Victoria had somehow arranged for 3 news vans and a reporter from the local station to cover what she'd described as a tragic case of judicial dementia endangering a vulnerable teenager. Cameras flashed as I walked up the courthouse steps, each click feeling like another nail in the coffin of my reputation. Mrs. Harrison, how do you respond to allegations that you're mentally unfit to care for your adopted daughter? A reporter thrust a microphone toward my face. I paused on the steps, looking directly into the camera. I respond the same way I always have in my 40 years of public service, by trusting that the truth will emerge in a court of law. Inside the courthouse, the contrast was jarring. This building had been my second home for decades, but now I was escorted to the defendant's table like any other respondent in a custody case. Harold sat beside me as my legal counsel, while Detective Kim took a seat in the gallery as a potential witness. Victoria arrived with an entourage that took my breath away. Marcus Wellington led the procession, followed by Dr. Elizabeth Foster carrying a thick psychological evaluation folder, Brenda Walsh, the social worker with her emergency custody paperwork, and Robert looking pale and uncomfortable in an expensive suit. But it was Victoria herself who commanded attention. She'd dressed for the cameras outside. Elegant black dress, perfectly styled hair, an expression of noble suffering that belonged in a movie about tragic family situations. She played the role of the concerned daughter-in-law, trying to save a teenager from her declining grandmother with Oscar-worthy precision. Emma sat in the gallery between 2 women I didn't recognize, court-appointed advocates, I realized, there to ensure her voice was heard. My daughter looked small and frightened, caught between the 2 women who claimed to want what was best for her. At exactly 2 p.m., the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison." My heart stopped. Patricia Morrison, no relation to Victoria despite the shared surname, was a judge I'd mentored 15 years ago when she was a young prosecutor. She'd sat in my courtroom dozens of times, learning procedure and precedent. She'd even attended my retirement party 5 years ago. As Judge Morrison entered and settled behind the bench, her eyes swept the courtroom and landed on me. For just a moment, her composed judicial expression flickered with something that might have been surprise, then concern, but she quickly returned to her professional demeanor. This emergency hearing concerns the custody of Emma Chen, a minor currently in the guardianship of Barbara Harrison. Mr. Wellington, you represent the petitioners? Yes, Your Honor. Wellington stood with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. We're seeking immediate emergency custody transfer due to Mrs. Harrison's documented mental decline and inability to provide adequate care for the minor child. Mrs. Harrison, you're represented by? Harold stood. Harold Martinez, Your Honor, representing Mrs. Harrison. I watched Judge Morrison's expression carefully as she processed Harold's name. She would remember him from our courtroom. He'd been legendary among local attorneys for his preparation and attention to detail. Mr. Wellington, present your evidence. What followed was a masterful performance of character assassination. Wellington methodically presented Victoria's documentation, the edited security footage showing me appearing confused and disoriented, statements from neighbors and former colleagues expressing concern about my mental state, medical records that had somehow been obtained showing my recent visits to doctors. Dr. Foster testified about cognitive decline in elderly individuals, describing symptoms that perfectly matched the behaviors Victoria had carefully orchestrated and recorded. Brenda Walsh presented a glowing report about Victoria's suitability as an alternative guardian, complete with financial stability assessments and character references. The most devastating moment came when Wellington played Emma's recorded statements, taken out of context, edited to remove my responses, crafted to sound like a teenager desperately trying to protect a grandmother who was becoming a danger to herself and others. Your Honor, Wellington concluded, Mrs. Harrison's decline from respected jurist to confused elderly woman is tragic, but undeniable. Emma Chen deserves a stable home environment, and Mrs. Victoria Morrison is prepared to provide exactly that. During the entire presentation, Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table radiating concern and reluctant determination. She'd even managed to produce a few tears when Emma's recorded voice filled the courtroom. Mr. Martinez, Judge Morrison said, your response? Harold stood slowly, and I could see him calculating every word before he spoke. Your Honor, we request permission to present evidence that will demonstrate this entire proceeding is based on fraud, manipulation, and criminal conspiracy. The courtroom stirred. Wellington shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Martinez is making inflammatory accusations without foundation. Your Honor, Harold continued calmly, if the court will indulge us for 10 minutes, we will demonstrate not only that Mrs. Harrison is completely competent, but that she has been the victim of an elaborate scheme to steal her adopted daughter's substantial trust fund. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Martinez, these are serious allegations. I hope you have substantial evidence to support them. We do, Your Honor. Harold moved to our evidence table and retrieved the digital recorder Miguel had placed in Wellington's office. Your Honor, we present a recording made yesterday in Mr. Wellington's office, capturing a conversation between the petitioner Victoria Morrison and her attorney discussing their true motivations for this custody action. The courtroom erupted. Wellington was shouting objections about illegal surveillance and inadmissible evidence. Victoria's face had gone white, her mask of concern replaced by naked panic. Your Honor, Harold said over the noise, this recording was obtained during a routine security check of the building where Mr. Wellington maintains his office. The device was placed by licensed security personnel in a common area where no expectation of privacy existed. Judge Morrison raised her hand for silence. I'll allow it. But Mr. Martinez, this better be relevant. Harold activated the recording device, and Victoria's voice filled the courtroom with crystal clarity. The old bitch has no idea what's coming. Once we get custody, I'll have complete control over Emma's trust fund. $2.7 million, Marcus. Even after your fees, that's enough to set me up for life. Wellington's voice responded, And if she fights the custody decision? She won't be fighting anything for long. I've been putting sedatives in her tea for weeks. A little increase in the dosage, maybe a fall down those steep stairs of hers, and the problem solves itself. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, staring at the recorder in shock. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Wellington, approach the bench immediately." But before Wellington could move, Harold was speaking again. "Your Honor, there's more." He played another segment of the recording. "The beautiful part is that everyone already thinks she's losing her mind. I've been documenting her confusion for months, getting people to witness her supposed memory problems. Even her own son believes she's declining." "And the girl? Emma?" "She's starting to doubt the old woman, too." A few more incidents, maybe a medical emergency where Barbara seems confused and helpless, and Emma will be begging to come live with us. Victoria was on her feet now, her composure completely shattered. "That recording is illegal. It's been edited. You can't use that against me." "Sit down, Mrs. Morrison." Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned from the best. "Mr. Martinez, continue your presentation." Harold moved to our second piece of evidence. "Your Honor, we also present security footage from Mrs. Harrison's bank, showing Mrs. Morrison making inquiries about accessing Emma's trust fund through emergency guardianship provisions." The footage played on a small screen, showing Victoria in animated conversation with bank officials, pointing to documents and taking notes about trust fund access procedures. "Additionally," Harold continued, producing a laboratory report, "we have evidence that Mrs. Morrison has been systematically drugging Mrs. Harrison with sedatives, creating the appearance of mental confusion while recording the results for use in this proceeding." Judge Morrison was no longer maintaining judicial neutrality. Her expression had hardened into something I recognized from my own courtroom, the look of a judge who'd just realized she was witnessing criminal behavior. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice ice-cold, "I'm ordering you to approach the bench immediately. And bailiff, please ensure that Mrs. Morrison does not leave this courtroom." But Victoria was already moving, pushing past Robert and heading toward the exit. She made it 3 steps before Detective Kim, who'd been waiting in the gallery, stepped into her path. "Mrs. Morrison," Detective Kim said, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and attempted murder." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Emma was crying in the gallery. Robert sat stunned at the plaintiff's table. Wellington was arguing frantically with Judge Morrison at the bench. And Victoria was screaming about frame-ups and illegal entrapment as Detective Kim led her away in handcuffs. Judge Morrison slammed her gavel repeatedly until order was restored. When the room was finally quiet, she looked directly at me for the first time since the hearing began. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, and there was something different in her voice now. Recognition, respect, and perhaps a touch of awe. "Would you please approach the bench?" I stood slowly, feeling 40 years of courtroom experience flooding back into my muscles and bones. As I approached the bench where I'd spent decades of my life, Judge Morrison leaned forward and whispered something that made my heart stop. "Your Honor, it is the greatest privilege of my career to have you in my courtroom. I only hope I can serve justice half as well as you taught me to." The young prosecutor I'd mentored 15 years ago had recognized not just my identity, but the magnitude of what had nearly been lost. As I returned to the defendant's table, which no longer felt like the defendant's table but rather like a different kind of bench from which to observe justice being served, I realized that Victoria had made one fatal error in her elaborate plan. She'd forgotten that judges, even retired ones, never really leave the courthouse. They just change seats. Judge Morrison's gavel fell with finality, but the sound echoed differently than it had at the beginning of this hearing. What had started as Victoria's carefully orchestrated character assassination had become something far more significant, a complete vindication of everything I'd spent my career defending. "Given the evidence presented," Judge Morrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "this court finds that the emergency custody petition was filed under fraudulent pretenses. Mrs. Harrison retains full custody of Emma Chen, with all rights and privileges restored immediately." She paused, looking directly at me. "Furthermore, This court is issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting Victoria Morrison or any of her associates from contacting Mrs. Harrison or Emma Chen. Mr. Wellington, your conduct in this matter will be reported to the State Bar Association for immediate disciplinary review. The courtroom remained eerily quiet as the implications sank in. Emma sat in the gallery, tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than confusion and fear. Your Honor, Harold said, standing beside me. Mrs. Harrison would like to address the court regarding additional measures to protect Emma's interests. Judge Morrison nodded. Mrs. Harrison, please proceed. I stood, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt the familiar weight of judicial authority settling on my shoulders. Not because I was presiding over this courtroom, but because I was advocating for something that mattered more than any case I'd ever handled. Your Honor, during the investigation that led to today's revelations, we discovered that Emma's trust fund, established by her biological parents, has been the target of multiple access attempts by Mrs. Morrison over the past 6 months. We request that the court appoint an independent trustee to oversee these funds until Emma reaches majority. Granted, the court will appoint a professional trust administrator immediately. Judge Morrison made notes on her legal pad. Is there anything else, Mrs. Harrison? I looked across the courtroom at Robert, my son, who sat with his head in his hands, processing the destruction of his marriage and everything he'd believed about his wife. Emma was watching me with the same expression she'd worn 4 years ago when I'd first brought her home, hope mixed with uncertainty about whether this was really happening. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to request that this court's proceedings today be sealed to protect Emma's privacy. While Mrs. Morrison's criminal actions are a matter of public record, Emma should not have to live with the media attention surrounding this case. An excellent point. The court orders all records sealed except for those necessary for criminal prosecution. As Judge Morrison prepared to adjourn the hearing, Detective Kim approached the bench with additional documents. Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison has just been formally charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, attempted murder, and violation of pharmaceutical regulations. The district attorney's office will be seeking additional charges related to her previous activities in other states. The words attempted murder hung in the air like a verdict of their own. Victoria hadn't just been trying to steal Emma's money. She'd been planning to eliminate me entirely once she gained custody and control of the trust fund. Robert finally looked up from his hands, his face pale and aged by the revelations of the past hour. Mom, he said, his voice broken. I'm so sorry. I should have seen. I should have known. I walked over to where he sat at what had been the plaintiff's table. Robert, she manipulated you just as systematically as she manipulated everyone else. You're a victim here too. But I chose her over you. I believed her lies about your mental state. I was ready to let her take Emma away from you. The pain in his voice reminded me of the little boy who used to cry when he accidentally broke something, convinced that his mistakes were unforgivable. You chose what appeared to be the truth based on carefully fabricated evidence. That's not a moral failing. That's being human. Emma had moved from the gallery and now stood beside us, looking smaller than her 16 years. Mom, she said, and my heart swelled at her continued use of that word. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I believed her when she said you were getting confused and forgetful. I pulled Emma into my arms, feeling the solid reality of my daughter against me. Sweetheart, you protected yourself the only way you knew how. You were trying to take care of me while being manipulated by someone who should have been protecting you. That shows wisdom, not betrayal. Judge Morrison had been observing our family reconciliation with the patience that good judges develop over years of handling emotionally charged cases. When we'd finished, she spoke one final time. Mrs. Harrison, before I adjourn this hearing, I want to say something for the record. She looked directly at me, and I could see the young prosecutor she'd once been, sitting in my courtroom, learning how justice should be administered. 40 years ago, you took the bench in this courthouse with a commitment to protecting families and ensuring that the legal system served justice rather than convenience. Today, you reminded all of us what that commitment means. You faced a systematic attack on your competency, your integrity, and your right to raise your daughter. And you responded not with anger or revenge, but with evidence and truth. She paused, her voice growing stronger. This court has seen many custody cases, but rarely one where the stakes were so high and the deception so complete. Your response to this crisis demonstrates exactly why you were respected as one of the finest judges this district has ever known. The courtroom had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence, respectful rather than shocked, contemplative rather than stunned. Mrs. Harrison, Judge Morrison continued, I know you've been retired for 5 years, but I want you to know that this courthouse, this community, and this legal system are stronger because of your example, today and always. As we left the courtroom, Harold walked beside me carrying the evidence boxes that had saved Emma's future and possibly my life. Judge, he said quietly, have you thought about what comes next? What do you mean? The law school has been trying to recruit you as a guest lecturer for years. After today, I suspect that invitation is going to become much more attractive to you. I considered the idea as we walked through the courthouse corridors where I'd spent so much of my career, teaching young lawyers about family law, about the importance of protecting vulnerable clients, about recognizing and countering manipulation in legal proceedings. Actually, I said, I think I might be interested in that. Outside the courthouse, the media circus had grown larger. Word of Victoria's arrest and the true nature of the custody case had spread quickly. But now the reporters' questions were different. Judge Harrison, how does it feel to be vindicated after such a systematic attack on your character? I paused on the courthouse steps, Emma's hand in mine, Robert standing protectively beside us, Harold and Detective Kim flanking us like the legal team they'd become. It feels like justice, I said simply. Not revenge, not victory over an opponent, but justice. Which is what every family deserves when they walk into a courtroom seeking protection for their children. Will you be pressing additional charges against Mrs. Morrison? That decision rests with the district attorney's office. My focus now is on helping my daughter heal from this trauma and rebuilding our family's sense of security. 6 months later, I stood in front of a classroom of first-year law students at the state university, teaching a course called Family Law and Vulnerable Populations. Emma sat in the back row, having enrolled early in college courses through an accelerated program that would let her start law school at 18. Today, I told my students, we're going to discuss a case study about elder abuse, custody manipulation, and the importance of recognizing when legal proceedings are being used as weapons rather than tools of justice. I pulled up the sealed court records from our case, names redacted, details changed to protect privacy, but the essential facts preserved for educational purposes. The question I want you to consider as we review this case is this: how do we balance the need to protect vulnerable adults with the right of those adults to maintain autonomy and dignity? And how do we train ourselves to recognize when concern for someone's welfare is actually a mask for exploitation? Emma raised her hand from the back row. Professor Harrison, in a case like this, what's the most important thing for the legal system to remember? I smiled, hearing in her question the future lawyer she was becoming, shaped by her own experience of nearly being used as a pawn in someone else's greed. The most important thing, I said, is that vulnerability doesn't equal incompetence. Age doesn't equal inability. And sometimes the people who appear most concerned about protecting someone are actually the ones they most need protection from. As the class ended and students filed out, Emma approached my desk with a newspaper clipping she'd been saving. Mom, did you see this? She asked, showing me an article from the previous week's local paper. The headline read, Victoria Morrison, sentenced to 8 years for conspiracy and elder abuse. The article detailed how Victoria had ultimately been connected to similar schemes in 3 other states, affecting at least 6 elderly victims and their families. 8 years, Emma said quietly. Do you think that's enough? I looked at my daughter, now 17, confident, preparing for her own career in law, completely secure in our family bond that Victoria had tried so hard to destroy. I think it's enough time for her to understand that actions have consequences, I said. And I think it's enough time for all her future potential victims to be protected from her. Emma nodded, then smiled. Mom, I have something to tell you. What's that? I've decided on my specialization for law school, family law, with a focus on elder rights and protection. I felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Are you sure? It can be emotionally difficult work. I'm sure. Because of what happened to us, I understand what it feels like to be powerless in the system. I want to help other families who don't have a retired judge for a mother. That evening, as Emma and I prepared dinner together in our kitchen, the same kitchen where Victoria had humiliated me with infantile medication labels 6 months earlier, I reflected on how much had changed. The trust fund that had been Victoria's target was now safely managed by an independent administrator. Emma would receive her inheritance as intended, but more importantly, she'd learned lessons about resilience, justice, and the importance of fighting for truth that no amount of money could buy. Robert visited twice a week now, slowly rebuilding our relationship and processing his own trauma from discovering he'd been married to someone capable of planning murder for financial gain. He was in therapy, working through the guilt and manipulation he'd experienced, and gradually becoming the son I'd always known he could be. As for me, I'd discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of my contribution to justice. It meant finding new ways to use 40 years of experience to protect families and train the next generation of lawyers to recognize and fight the kind of evil that Victoria represented. "Mom," Emma said as we sat down to dinner, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't fought back? If you'd just accepted what Victoria was doing to you?" I considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes. But you know what I realized? What? Some people spend their whole careers talking about justice, but when it came time to fight for what mattered most, you, our family, the truth, I discovered that everything I'd learned on the bench had prepared me for that moment. Emma smiled. "So Victoria actually did us a favor, in a weird way." "No," I said firmly. "Victoria committed serious crimes that could have destroyed our lives. But we turned her attack into an opportunity to prove that justice still works when good people refuse to give up." As we finished dinner, I looked around our home. The same house Victoria had tried to steal from me. The same kitchen where she'd drugged my tea. The same living room where she'd broken my judicial award in a calculated act of humiliation. But now it felt different. Not because anything physical had changed, but because we'd reclaimed it. We'd proven that manipulation might win battles, but truth and persistence win wars. The last piece of evidence from our case sat in a frame on my mantel. Not the broken judicial award, which I'd never bothered to repair, but a letter from Judge Morrison thanking me for reminding her why she'd become a lawyer in the first place. "Justice isn't just about what happens in courtrooms," the letter read. "It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, even when the system seems stacked against them. Thank you for showing all of us what that looks like." Emma was right about one thing. Victoria had inadvertently done us a favor. She'd proven that our family bond was stronger than her manipulation, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from refusing to let them destroy you. And every day I taught law students about recognizing and fighting exploitation. Every day Emma grew stronger and more determined to protect others. Every day Robert healed from his own trauma and became a better father and son. Those were days when justice continued to be served. Not with gavels and verdicts, but with the quiet, persistent work of rebuilding what evil had tried to destroy. That, I realized, was the most important lesson of all.